Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Genealogy, a novel, by Mae Wood, narrated by Sarah Mollo-Christensen. 1. Allie. Present day. August. She didn't want to move, and I didn't want her to move either. But we were doing it, together. Sifting and sorting, shredding and donating, culling a lifetime into piles to be packed and placed into boxes. The lucky things would end up in my grandmother's new 623-square-foot assisted living apartment. The not-so-lucky would end up on a curb. "These linens," she said, pointing to the bottom drawer of the sideboard in her formal dining room. "You need them." "Grammy, I don't even have a dining room table," I said, trucking along in our project to conquer the contents of at least one room this weekend. "You had one before, and you'll have one again, and these are Irish linen." I thought of my tiny kitchen table, covered in discarded mail and unread magazines, not draped in substantial creamy white. She knew I didn't have the space. I made space for the vintage black satin peep-toe pumps of hers from the 50s and had placed those in the alley pile with a smile, but linens were a different story. The tablecloths were huge, for a table big enough to seat a dozen guests. "They were Alice's," she said. The trump card played, I bent and pulled them from the low drawer. I was Alice's namesake, but I'd always gone by Allie because Alice felt formal and traditional, two words that didn't fit me. She was the great-grandmother who I'd never met, who died a decade before I was born, but whose existence was never far from my mind. Allie, A-L-I, I'd explained 1,000,000 times over my life. "It's short for Alice. I'm named for my great-grandmother." "Well, one good thing is that your monograms match." I fingered the tiny beverage napkins, trimmed in hand-tatted lace and embroidered with A-L-W. A-L-W. I smiled. Alice Lenore Wertheimer. Alice Lenora Waller. I was flirting with becoming Alice Waller Sayer, but I was solidly myself at the moment. "Did she embroider these?" I asked, the old fabric stiff and smooth to the touch. "I don't know. I don't remember my mother doing any needlework, but I suppose all women did back then." "True," I said, flattening out the material with my palm and tugging out a crease. I dragged yet another plastic bin over and began piling the linens in, amazed that they had survived the years. "The story on one of those tablecloths is that it was a wedding present from some member of the Denny family." Ah, an old Seattle story. I knew it wasn't going to be long before I got one. My ancestors were early settlers of the city, and my grandmother carried the banner of native Seattleite proudly, looking down her pioneer nose at the Microsofties and the Californians who had invaded her precious land. And though she'd moved to Kansas City with my grandfather nearly 50 years ago, the city was in her DNA. I half listened to her prattle on about some trip to Japan to obtain plants and animals for the Woodland Park Zoo as I examined the linens and placed them in the plastic storage tub. "Okay," I said, looking around the room, the sideboard now empty. Something accomplished today, and it made me feel good to have one of the many small tasks that it would take to empty her house of nearly 50 years. I looked at my watch. I have to leave at 3 to head back to the hospital, so what can we get done in an hour? "One drawer to go," she said from the dining chair where she'd settled in, where I'd knelt in front of the sideboard. "The bottom one." Her words made my chest ache, but also soothed them. I hated that she was getting confused more often. It reminded me that one day Grammy would be gone, but it also convinced me that we were making the right decision to move her. No more worry about her alone in this big house. "All done," I said, pointing to my tub of linens. "The bottom one, Allie. The apron is a drawer." "I didn't know that," I said, feeling sheepish that I'd thought she had been confused. "A secret drawer?" "That's the point," she said. The sideboard had been in this house my entire life, and I'd never known that. I tilted my head to look at the piece, not quite believing her. "It's where your grandpa kept his favorite pistol." "Still there?" I said with a smile, reaching down under the lip of the cabinet. "Well, maybe. It's been a long time since I dug around in that thing." "I'm going to change your name to Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler," I said, giving the concealed drawer a tug. It didn't budge. Maybe she was confused after all. "Or Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, but only if we find a Degas or pirate gold." "It was a statue of an angel. Leonardo da Vinci," she corrected me. In and out, touch and go, here and there. I was never sure where a conversation would lead us, and based upon the swelling in her extremities, I wasn't sure today was going to be a good day for coherent conversation. It wasn't her head so much as her heart that was slowly killing her by refusing to pump. She needed access to round-the-clock medical care now, not just sitters and family at the house, and we were making that happen, although no one was happy about it. "Oh, that's right," I replied, the memories flooding back of the story of a headstrong girl and her younger brother running away to the Met. What I really remember about that book was them taking a bath in the fountain. My grandmother and I were very close. The afternoons of my childhood had been spent at her house with my brother and sister, and while my parents were at work, Grammy showered us with troves of books. She was a children's librarian, or she had been until she'd gotten married, because, as she'd explained a million times to me over the years, in those days nice women didn't work outside the home after they were married, and so she'd retreated to a life of children and tennis and dinner parties. I gave the drawer another tug, and it budged a few inches, but it didn't slide open. "Oh, and the sideboard is yours too. No argument, it was—" "Alice's?" I guessed as I wiggled the drawer open to find not pieces of 8 or a sketch of a ballerina, but more table linens. "No, her mother's. You'll be the 5th generation of women in our family to own it." I looked at the dark, heavy Victorian behemoth with new eyes, knowing it was going home with me, and knowing I had nowhere in my tiny IKEA-furnished apartment to put it. But I spoke the truth. "Thank you. I'll be a good caretaker." "I know you will, sweet pea." I looked down at the linens, focusing on the task rather than the meaning of the work I was doing, filling the plastic bin with more ancient fabric than I'd ever begin to use. Under the last tablecloth, I found a small, flat box. The pistol? I recognized the foil-stamped logo. Frederick and Nelson, the grand Seattle department store that now only existed on Grammy's bad days when she'd ask me or someone else to take her there for lunch. "Grandpa's gun?" I asked, setting the box into my lap as I sat on the floor. I lifted the lid. "Papers," I said, a little weary at the prospect of spending the last bit of time before I had to leave focused on her reading each paper carefully before deciding whether she could part with it. My grandmother was a pack rat. I'd recently dropped off 2 decades of yellow-spined National Geographics at the recycling center, and her garage was still stuffed to the gills with boxes of papers. I'd had visions of a huge bonfire while she was at a doctor's appointment, just to speed up the process. The box resting in my cross-legged lap, I riffled through the contents. "Letters," I said, pulling one out. At least it wasn't receipts from the 1960s, though the hospital bill from my mom's tonsillectomy at age 8 had been a gem. The total bill was a few $100s, and Mom had spent 3 days in a children's ward. Most of my patients were sent home by the end of the day with a bill in the thousands. The cream envelope was golden at the seams, the clean cursive writing enchanting. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen graceful, purposeful handwriting with a fountain pen, and not just a hasty scrawl of ballpoint on a scratch pad. Alice Hirschhorn, the letter's front proclaimed. Letters to Alice, I told Grammy, now curious. I examined the faded postmark and noticed the stamps were strange. From the Philippines? I guessed. I have those, my grandmother said, her voice full of excitement and disbelief. In answer, I turned the envelope in my palm, slid the pages out, and carefully unfolded the letter. September 20th, 1915. My dearest Alice, the script greeted me. A love letter. 100-year-old love letter. Great-grandpa was in the Philippines? I asked, my eyes and brain straining to decipher the tight calligraphy. Oh, no, not your great-grandfather, Grammy said, her eyes sparkling with her mother's secrets. Elliot. Who's Elliot? I asked, my eyes scanning through the pages, trying to make sense of the fancy script. When was the last time I'd seen a handwritten letter? Something more than the note that my sister tucked in with her kids' drawings for me to put on my fridge. A 6-page letter, with no scratched-out sections even. Was this like a final draft? Did people do that back then? Write drafts of letters, work to get their words just right, and then write it out nicely on fancy stationery? Or did they think before they wrote? Either way, the whole concept of handwritten letters was foreign to me. Some man Alice knew. He wanted her to move to the Philippines with him, but that's all I know. What do you mean, that's all you know? That's really all I know. I found the letters once when I was a girl. I started reading them, and my mother found me, took the letters, and I don't remember seeing them again. I guess I kept them when she died, but that was so long ago that I don't quite remember. 40-ish years ago, I said, looking up at her. I'm going to take them. Fine with me, but the dining room table goes with them. There were seconds when I was thankful her memory was going, and then I would spend hours, if not days, feeling awful for those moments. As the math on how much a storage unit would cost me for the year or so we could hope she'd be with us floated through my brain, this was one of those times. I set the letters with the linens and began straightening up before I made us a simple late lunch of sandwiches and left. Next time we'll dive into the china cabinet, I said as I grabbed my purse and work tote. Mom will be back from Austin tomorrow. She's been down with Jess and her family. I'll be MIA all week with work, but we'll have dinner together. Sounds lovely, sweet pea, she said as we exchanged kisses to cheeks. I'm so glad you moved home, Allie. I truly am. Me too, I said, but I didn't mean it. 2. Allie. August. Rounds at the hospital were about getting into the zone where I, Alice Lenora Waller, didn't exist, and some fictional Dr. Waller strode through the halls. I knew doctors had a bad rap when it came to ego and attitude. I was no different. And I definitely could have the attitude, but the ego that people claimed I had, that had fallen away 6 months ago. After 3 months back in Kansas City, I was still getting the feel of the place, even though I knew the hospital, with its surgical suites, cafeterias, and my clinic, like the back of my hand. But the parts of the city that hadn't been there when I was in high school? The parts that had changed in the years since I'd left for college? So many restaurants, faces, and names that were all new to me. Except for a smattering of high school friends, only a few who I'd kept in close contact with over the years, the city was entirely familiar, yet new to me. I was a blue-scrubbed, white-coated doctor who lived just south of the downtown medical district, among the other blue-scrubbed, white-coated doctors, the blue-scrubbed, short-coated medical students, not to mention the brightly scrubbed nurses and other medical staff. It was a far cry from the lily-white suburb I'd grown up in, but still felt provincial after my time in D.C. and Boston. Most mornings I walked to work. It was hot and humid, and I nearly regretted it, but it was less than a mile, and I liked the time to clear my head. Because as much as I refused to admit it, sometimes I still woke up in Boston with Scott warm in the bed next to me, skin to skin but for the slip of a silk gown I liked to sleep in. And it took me rolling over to smack my phone's alarm or my pager and finding myself alone to remember that he wasn't here, that he wasn't on call, that he was in California, where I was supposed to have been. Home again, jiggity-jig. My hair in a tight braid, the tail end pinned under, I slung my black messenger bag across my body. I trudged to the hospital, nabbing a to-go box of random breakfast items that would go cold as I picked at my meal, but devoured the files in front of me. I had 2 surgery days a week, clinics 3 days a week, and an erratic on-call schedule that was grueling. Lowest man or woman on the group's totem pole meant that I covered holidays and got exactly 1 3-day weekend a month completely off the calendar. I wouldn't change a thing about it, except the location. The practice itself was what I'd wanted, and I shunted the thoughts of sunny beaches and a sexy orthopod off to the side of my thoughts as best as I could. Because when I began thinking about that life that I didn't have, that life I'd anticipated, I could only catalog my faults and failings. The first being every minutia that distinguished me from Thad Graves, the guy from Chicago who had landed the spot, my spot, as the cochlear implant specialist at UC Irvine. I didn't get the job, and the life that I'd planned around it disappeared. Having life's first big failure at 33 wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person, but I wasn't used to any failure, and it made me feel awful. I'd decided to lick my wounds at home while I decided on my next move. Now I was stuck in limbo, filling in for a surgeon in Kansas City who was taking a sabbatical, and spending my free time looking for a permanent position. Home again, jiggity-jog. At my desk, I washed down a bite of gummy oatmeal with cold coffee and scrolled through the file on my laptop. 17-month-old male. Bilateral profound deafness since birth. 2 weeks post-op. And today was the payoff. I was a computer science major in college, and during medical school I developed an interest in cochlear implants because the technology fascinated me. But when, during my internship, I was in the room when a baby turned his head at his mother's voice for the first time in his life, and I saw his eyes light up in excitement and his parents break down in sobbing joy, I was hooked. The capacity to change lives, the ability to give someone the perception of sound. No other medicine did that, offered something so fundamental to the human condition. No one created vision. No one transplanted the olfactory system or supplemented a sense of taste. No one could make a patient feel again. But we could make a patient hear. And I knew the detractors, the people who thought I was personally involved in some sort of attack on the deaf community. And I didn't buy what they were selling, because today Jackson Ursini's life was going to change. That I was sure of. I dumped the remains of my breakfast into the trash bin and went to greet him and his parents. I didn't regularly go to mappings, but Jackson was special. He was my first patient, from consult through procedure, that I'd cared for at this hospital. I wanted to be there for him, for his parents, but mostly for myself. Because this was going to go right. I was determined it was. When I entered the room, Jackson was perched in his mom's lap with a pacifier in his mouth, connected by a lead to the computer that Stacy, the audiologist, controlled. "Jackson?" his mom said, her voice quavering, looking from her son to me with worry on her face. "You're not going to break him? Call to him," I encouraged her. "Back on now," said Stacy. Stronger, Mrs. Ursini spoke. "Jackson?" Jackson kept sucking on his pacifier. "Again," Stacy instructed. "Jack! Jack!" A big, hopeful smile spread on her face, not quite reaching her eyes, which were filling with worry. "Jackson?" Still no response. My anxiety was beginning to rise, because this was all a gamble. A gamble by the parents to put their baby through surgery, taking the risk that he'd make it through the procedure and that this contraption that we installed and calibrated would work. There were no guarantees, no promises, only science and chance and guts. Stacy tinkered on the computer, and I walked over to stand behind her shoulder to look at what was happening. "Yeah," I said softly, agreeing with her as she increased the threshold. "Again," said Stacy. "Jackson, Jackson," Mrs. Ursini jostled him on her knees. "Jackson, Jackson, Jackson," she kept calling. Jackson's eyes grew big, and his head began to swivel. 17 months of silence, broken by his mother's voice. There was no need for Stacy's encouragement anymore. "Jackson, oh, Jackson, I love you. I love you, Jackson, I love you." The words rushed out of his mother's smiling mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. Jackson's confusion intensified, and that was normal. He was plunged into a world of sound, a world he didn't know existed. And as much as I'd like to say it was like a schmaltzy movie and he would look at his mom and smile sweetly and coo at her, the odds were that wasn't going to happen. In fact, some would cry. Some would become agitated and scared. But it was all magic. Getting his brain to process sound was my gig, and we'd done that. Now it was up to the engineers and audiologists and therapists to get him to understand sound and language. I quietly slipped out of the room, wanting to let Stacy do her thing and the Ursini family have this time. The rest of the afternoon was filled with 2 pediatric consults, reams of reporting to complete, and after yet another dinner at my favorite of the hospital's cafeterias, I walked home through the darkness to my apartment. I woke up the next day not to my pager or the alarm on my cell, but to an actual phone call. Only a half-dozen people could get through my Do Not Disturb setting, and I'd answer every one of those calls in a heartbeat. "Good morning, Grammy," I said, rolling to my back and holding the phone to my ear in the darkness. "Allie, I've sent the men with the dining room table, the chairs, and the sideboard to your apartment." "Grammy," I began, wanting to tell her that she hadn't told me about a delivery, but knowing that she didn't need the grief. No harm had been done, except my interrupted sleep. And interrupted sleep? I made it through a residency and a fellowship. I didn't know what uninterrupted sleep was. "They say you won't answer your door." I wrenched my phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. Sure enough, 4 missed calls. Perhaps I should also set my door buzzer to ring through. I smirked. "Thanks, Grammy. I'll let them in." I buzzed in the delivery guys and looked around my apartment, trying to figure out where to put the sideboard. Shoving around a few unopened boxes from my move, whose contents were a complete mystery to me, I made some space in the living room. I could put my TV on top of it, I decided. Soon enough, 2 well-built men left with my IKEA TV stand and kitchen table as part of their tip, and I was the proud owner of a sideboard and a long mahogany dining table. For all my formal dinner party needs. A text from Scott beeped through on my phone, pulling me from my daydream of a table full of friends laughing over cartons of Chinese delivery. He was asking if I was around, and for once, the stars aligned. I didn't even bother texting back. I called him. "Hey," he exhaled. Even in a single word, I felt his exhaustion. "Long day?" I asked, giving him the opening to dump his troubles on me. "And an awful one. 3 hours into a total hip and the patient coded." And the specter that haunts every surgeon raised its head. No one wants a patient to die on the table. Early in my residency, I'd been pulling a gallbladder and the patient went into cardiac arrest. We'd stabilized her, but it remained the scariest moment of my life. Far scarier even than the ER rotation, when you never knew what was coming. Because in the ER, the patient arrived in distress that you hadn't caused, and your goal was to stabilize. That moment with the gallbladder patient, I'd had a hand in that. That sucks. Yeah, it does. Just got done talking with the family, so tell me something good. Anything good. Well, I'm now the proud owner of an antique dining room suite. Grammy forced it on me, and now it's taking up about half of my apartment. It's huge. Furniture? That's the best you can do? I've got a long weekend coming up, I said, rushing to make him happy and soothe him. So 3 days together in SoCal? That sounds cool, if we can swing 3 days. Send me the dates and I'll run it against my schedule. If we can swing it? I could definitely swing it. Even if he was on call and got stuck at the hospital, there wasn't a reason that I couldn't get in a few days of sunshine and we could enjoy a few meals together, even if just someplace quick, and I could sleep in a bed that smelled like him. Okay, I said, not wanting to fight with him right now. I'll send you the dates. Let me know and I'll book flights. Cool, I'm being paged. Talk to you later. Love you. Love you, I replied, echoing his words and trying to not let his brusqueness bother me. He'd had one of the worst days a doctor can have, and I shouldn't read anything into his distance. It had been a hard few months on our relationship as we sorted out the long-distance thing, and I kept looking for a permanent position near him. I sat down at my new-to-me dining room table, an antique chair creaking under my weight, and surveyed the delivery. I decided I should pack away the linens back into their home. Turning on a news podcast to keep me company, I started my task, unfolding and refolding the tablecloths and embroidered napkins of all sizes, and there, on the bottom of the bin, was the box of love letters. I set them aside until all the ancient linens were back in their sideboard home. Switching off the podcast and warming up my coffee, I opened the Frederick and Nelson box of Alice's letters and wished I knew anything about archiving. I didn't want to ruin them, but I suppose they were now mine to ruin. I counted. Over 36 letters. The postmarks and stamps were mainly from the Philippines, but some were from Japan and one was from Hong Kong. I organized them based upon postmark date as best I could. September 1915 through May 1918. Nearly 3 years. And what was the story? 3 years ago, my life looked very different. Scott and I met 3 years ago. Had moved in together about 2 years ago. Less than a year ago, we'd talked about getting married. 6 months ago, we were California-bound. And now, here I was in a one-bedroom apartment, 5 miles away from the house I'd grown up in, and alone except for my family and my high school best friend. I opened the first letter and, struggling with the cursive, began to read. Dear Alice, North America is behind me, but you are at the forefront of my thoughts. We've just bid farewell to North America as the Canadian coast slipped away. It's unseasonably cool and the water is rough. I was expecting bright blue skies and smooth seas, but that is not the case. Tea, regular small meals, and walks around the deck help keep the nausea away, but I ache nonetheless.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?